This is India Today Podcasts.
We internalize childhoods in ways we might not be aware of and which science is still trying to understand properly. Some scientists believe that one deciding factor of what we remember and later use in our life are often those things that we believe will help us survive one day, because that is ultimately one strong purpose of being alive. I remember eating curd when I have the flu is not good for me. I still feel very angry if somebody tries to incite conflict around me. I never take cable cars in the mountains. I don't know where I have learned these, but it comes very naturally to me, and it's quite likely that either someone said this to me in my early childhood or I experienced something that indicated these things were not safe for me, they're not good for my well-being. There are people who stay away from animals, there are those who fear allopathic medicine, or discover as adults that they have an intense need to control their surroundings just to feel all right with themselves. Some of it is nature, you could argue that we're born this way. Some of it is nurture, which is our environment. Exactly which is responsible and to what extent one is responsible to the way our personalities build and shape is still quite unclear. But this much is known that sometimes nurture or the environment you are in can be so harsh, so unsafe, that it doesn't matter what your nature is. You will end up creating a survival sense that is really a series of trauma responses to what you grew up in. You start believing that in order to be safe or to survive, this is the right response to certain things. So, for example, children who grow up hearing the sound of gunfire, seeing soldiers or policemen everywhere, and never know when family members might just vanish forever, they are quite likely to respond to certain situations very differently from you and me. This is Sonali Acharji, and you are listening to Health Wealth, a podcast that wants to help you understand various aspects of health and well-being, but without overwhelming you and giving you a sense of connection to what we're talking about. In the last few years, and certainly in the last few months, the world has witnessed so much of violence and conflict. And as a journalist, I am surrounded by news, so I can't avoid it. But there are certain subsections of news that I find very difficult to view. I get very overwhelmed if I have to read it as well. But in the recent Israel-Gaza war, very often I have found it very difficult to turn a blind eye to this type of news, which is news of children suffering, news of what the violence does to very, very young human beings. One story which I haven't been able to put out of my head, and I still experience certain emotional responses when I think about it, is of a little girl. She was about 6 or 7, who pulled out toys from under a rubble and carried them all the way back to a hospital to play with her siblings because those toys represented normalcy and safety, and it meant something to them. And I wanted to understand that in India, even though we thankfully don't have a war-like situation, we do have places of conflict. We do have places where there's generational trauma remaining. How do children who are growing up here and who are born here, how do they respond to this? How are they internalizing trauma, which the remains of which might be all around them? What makes them feel safe? And most importantly, as a responsible society, how do we help them? And I have with me today someone who's very special because I think her work is so relevant and important for the future of, or at least the direction in which this world is heading. Her name is Parvathy Nair, and she is a consultant in mental health and psychosocial support for UNICEF in Chhattisgarh. Hi, Parvathy.
Hi, Sonali.
How are you?
I am good. Thank you. I'm very glad to be here.
Thank you so much for coming. I actually thought we could start with just talking a little about where you are and putting things in perspective. You are in Chhattisgarh, and while there's not active conflict or war, there is a memory of it. And would that also affect the next generation in the same way an active conflict would? Or does it impact them differently?
Right. So, as you said, yes, I am in Chhattisgarh, and the conflict that you see in Chhattisgarh, which is sort of an ongoing struggle between left wing extremism and armed forces, it's definitely been reduced to pockets. But the nature of conflicts that you see in India in general, compared to what you would see on the global landscape, is that most of it is prolonged. And and this applies to Chhattisgarh as well, that there is no point at which communities affected can say for sure that it is over. So definitely the impact of ongoing conflict at its peak is very different from a prolonged conflict. But what happens with the latter is that over a period of time, a climate of insecurity is built up. And the way that communities, parents, children, adolescents, how they understand normalcy changes. So you were referring to trauma responses. So I think definitely you can see aspects of that, but just larger ways of engaging and understanding the world is impacted.
Mhm. I use the word trauma responses, and certainly because I've been reading about it, I have a sense of what it is. But I thought, could you maybe explain a little bit about what these trauma responses would look like for a child, say, growing up in an area where there has been intense conflict?
So trauma, see, like you were saying, the as children, your brains are still developing. Those are the formative years, right? And when you experience conflict at that time, it changes or has an impact on the basic neurochemistry of the brain, right? Both the structure and the functioning of it. So if you take the example of a child who is in an active conflict situation and let's say has witnessed or experienced violence firsthand, the trauma responses could be a range of things you would see, largely that could be visible, largely in emotional or behavioral ways. So it could be a lot of, what you call hyper arousal. So just a lot of alertness that is not something you would expect for a child to have, right? Getting agitated by very, very small things, finding it extremely difficult to trust, right? Or form relationships with peers or to engage with peers. Trauma responses sometimes can be just a child not speaking, right? Just being withdrawn. The shock of what they have witnessed could have an impact. But over a period of time, those responses can also change depending on whether help has been provided or not, if there is a support system available to the child. So a lot of factors can come in to influence or determine what plays out in the long run.
Yeah. And one of the things which I think very few people talk about is we say what does trauma look like and we talk about solutions. But before we even get to the solutions, is there a way in which we can measure or quantify trauma? And is that even needed?
Um, I think yes, we need to have a way to measure or understand trauma. I don't know if quantify would be something that is always possible because that's a numbers game there. And a lot of traumatic experiences can be individual specific, culture specific, because going back to some of the examples you were giving, our mental health is significantly influenced by the world around us and the culture we grow up in, the values and beliefs we are exposed to. And that applies to how we deal with stress and situations as well. But it has been tried and tested and done. There is something called, especially with what's happening in Gaza and the issues there. They have developed something called the Gaza traumatic event checklist, which is specific to capturing the experiences and the adverse experiences that children are likely to have. The issue is we don't have something that's specific for India. And whether we're talking of conflict in Chhattisgarh or the Northeast, it is important for us to know what prolonged conflict is doing to children, how it goes beyond just emotional and behavioral concerns when you're talking about, trauma or the impact of conflict on children. It changes the way children view the world. It changes the way children view themselves as they grow up, as they become adults. It can change the way they look at purpose and meaning of life, their expectations of future happiness or their aspirations. So we need to be able to capture those experiences or the lived reality of children, right, in the background of constant insecurity, right? That what is it doing to these children? What kind of impact is it having? So I think trauma needs to be measured, it needs to be explored, but in the background of the lived experiences and the larger culture that children exist in.
Yeah, yeah. Because children are so innocent almost, in the way that they'll internalize certain things without thinking too much. I have a friend's daughter who I was talking to recently, and she said, I hate mornings. And I said, well, it's okay. Some people are night people, some people are morning people, and that's all right. And I just assumed it's that she finds it difficult to wake up. And then, as she continued to talk, it emerged she hates mornings because her parents fight over getting ready for work, and someone's late, and she sees that conflict, and she thinks mornings are when people fight. And no one has said that to her, no one has indicated that to her, but she just assumed the rest of the world is also like this. My Sonali auntie will also fight with me in the morning. She won't fight with me in the afternoon. So it's very interesting when you see how the mind processes things like this.
I think it's like you're saying, when even if you look at something like self-esteem, we are not born with a concept of self-esteem. So how do we learn to appreciate ourselves? How do we learn to value ourselves? It comes initially from outside to within, right? You see how the world is treating you, how your family responds, what are the things that they are, praising you for, and what are the things that you're met with disapproval, right? And that's how you build a sense of self-esteem. Now, this applies to most things.
Yeah.
Children are highly adaptable and resilient. There is no doubt about it. But it also means that they are constantly learning from the environment, but doing so implicitly. It's not that kind of learning that happens in the classroom, right? It's so gradual, it is so spontaneous. So they can't filter out at that age that this is what is good, this is what is bad, this is what is problematic. It just sort of meshes in together. And what is then supposed to be an age of curiosity, and play and growth and nurturance, when there is conflict or trauma, it sort of gets built in, right? That imprint is there. So it's very difficult to sort of point out and say that this behavioral problem or this personality trait would have come from there. But there is enough research to say that when children are exposed to conflict or when they grow up in a climate of insecurity, it changes their perception, it changes their beliefs. I'm not really sure how much of a sense of, psychological safety that is so necessary for a child that they would actually be able to experience in that environment.
Yeah. Today morning as I was driving down, I was thinking that what Parvathy might be seeing, getting to know of children who are traumatized, or getting to hear of examples of how that trauma is manifesting. I wouldn't be able to do it. I know it's a difficult life, and it requires a certain amount of emotional resilience, which I fear I won't have. But having said that, are there a few instances or experiences you've had that have really impacted you in some way and which made you feel that, yes, the way trauma manifests is just so profound at times. I mean, you just can't think of, you can't really put your finger on it.
Um, I'll give you two instances. One was a direct experience, and one is something that I've observed and seen in the region. So about a year and a half back, I was working at the field level, and I was providing mental health services and direct mental health support to children. And I happened to meet this girl about ninth standard, and she came to me. She said, "I want to talk to you, Didi." I said, "Okay, what's going on?" And she was saying that, I'm constantly worried, right? So I said, okay. And in the initial session, she was finding it very difficult to verbalize, to express in language what she was feeling. So we did a little bit of art and drawing. It took a while. But a couple of sessions later, she was telling me that at a very young age, she lost her uncle, right? When she was maybe 4, 5, 6 years old. But she remembers him fondly, and this was a person that was important in her life. And his death was a result of the conflict, right? It was part of some operation or something in the background that was happening. And she says every time she's away from home now, she's worried that when she goes back, will the same people still be there or not, right? And this is something that she's experiencing in the back of her mind, but it took her time to even understand that this is what she was thinking, or this is where the worry is coming from. And so she felt this need to constantly reach out or call, which was not possible in the situation she was in. But that was where the worry was stemming from, that she wanted constant assurance that, are you guys still there? Are my parents still there? Are my relatives still there? And it makes it very difficult to understand how do you help a child navigate a situation like this, right? Because there is no assurance you can give the child that they will still be there, right? It is the worry is a part of the larger existing reality as well. So this was something that has stayed with me. The other was that I think this was about 2 years back. This was something that was in the local newspaper in Bastar region, where an 11-year-old boy was going back home from his hostel. And he was stopped by some security forces on the road, and they checked his bag and they found medicines that he had carried from the hostel. And when they asked him, he said it's for a sick family member. And they were operating with the assumption that no, this is for an insurgent who's there in the village, and the child is right providing medical support. Now, irrespective of what the truth of the situation might be, the conflict is leading to a situation where people are operating with the assumption that 11-year-olds, right, children, could be a part of providing assistance. That something that could be innocent, right, can be interpreted as an act that has criminal, nature or consequences. So and this is, I'm saying, something that was reported. So many of these instances children would have, right? But they constantly come into contact with security forces. They might have to explain their behavior. Things that a child in a city would do that is just, you wouldn't even think about it twice because it is so mundane, right? Would elicit responses here. And so this goes back to the idea that for children, how we see normalcy in a city and how you see normalcy in a conflict region is very, very different, right? There is no sort of safety there. And I find that to be quite problematic.
Yeah. We do have child protection services in not just in areas where there has been or there is conflict ongoing. We have it all across the country. How do child protection services actually work? And, are they effective right now?
So in India, the child protection services is sort of a combination of a lot of different bodies and stakeholders and functionaries working together, including the judiciary, the police, policy. All of this comes together. And a very simplistic way to understand child protection is that you proactively try to assess the risks and challenges that children in India have growing up, and you try and create a safety net for children so that it reduces the chances of children being exposed to risk, right? And if children are exposed to risk, if they lose a parent at an early age or there is displacement, they're separated, then you create a system where you can stabilize the child. You can provide the child with a safe environment, to grow up, to go to school, to engage with daily activities, and so on. Child protection services in India have definitely come a long way. You have a lot of both, development sector organizations and NGOs working very actively with government bodies, including the Women and Child Department, right? Whether it is in terms of capacity building or proactively understanding the issues that are impacting children on a large scale. So, whether it is child sexual abuse, exploitation, trafficking, child labor, child marriage, all of it, right? So that we can mitigate these risks. And I do think to a large extent, they are working effectively. However, how responsive or accommodating they are towards conflict is something where there is a huge gap.
And there is also a lot of growing intolerances, when there'll be like sudden bursts of some sort of violence and then things die down. And I remember when the riots happened in Delhi, which would have been early 2020, we were going through the rubble and we found so many things belonging to very young children. There were stuffed animals, of course, and dolls and some notebooks and ribbons and clothes, baby clothes. We found so many of them just lying around burnt, and so it was very obvious that children had lived here, children had seen this. But at that point, for this sort of a situation where there's just a sudden eruption of violence and it goes away, how do we help children in these cases? Do we have systems built for this as well?
So the existing systems, especially if you talk of institutionalized setups, whether it is state-run, setups for children in need of care and protection, those are functioning. Especially Delhi has a very wide network of those institutions. So, for example, if a child has lost a family member, or a parent, and is in need of shelter, is in requirement of that, there are institutional setups to provide immediate safety for the child. But if you look at the long-term impact, right, all those children who are impacted by that riot to varying degrees, even if they did not lose a parent, but if they have a lot of children, I've read studies post the Delhi riots where children of different religions have had issues going back to school, have had issues with their identity, right? Have had issues figuring out where they belong, do they belong or not. So those nuanced issues is something that currently those protection services are not able to address. And I think when you talk of growing intolerance, as you talk of, the divisions that exist in society and the marginalization that exists, and it definitely seeps down to children who belong to those identities, the protection services need to expand to be able to respond to those experiences that children may have had, right? Whether it is debriefing children or providing, sessions to those children, even if it is not an individual one-to-one session, but something that can help children comprehend what happened. Why did it happen? How can it impact my life, right? What are the changes I can see when I might go back to school? Who can I reach out to for help? So these are conversations we are assuming that parents are having with children. We have no way to know that are children understanding or not. So if the protection network is able to consider these issues and address it, I think that's how we will be, prepared for situations that are going to come in the future.
Yeah. So, when we talk of scaling up any sort of systems, manpower or the people involved is always a consideration. Certainly, when we talk about physical health or physical well-being, the scarcity or the lack of doctors for certain specialities is a challenge. In the same way, is that the same for child protection services?
I think the current system works as such that we not only don't have enough manpower, but we don't have enough competent manpower, right? So there are, even in child protection services, if you have counselors attached to institutions, you would ideally want these counselors to come from mental health background, right, or social work background with training specifically to look at trauma informed approaches. But the larger mental health scenario is such that there is such huge scarcity of professionals, right? The treatment gap in India is currently huge. So when you consider those, then definitely in terms of workforce, it is a huge problem that we don't have enough people, enough competent people to reach out. And so currently, then what is being done is, more workforce development of the ones who are already there, but the numbers are still not enough, right? We need way more people working. We need more counselors, who are trained, who are able to engage and use different therapeutic approaches to work with children. And that is something that is not currently there.
Yeah. You know, at the start of the podcast, I was talking that, or rather, I was mentioning that one would like to make the things that we discuss relatable. In that sense, somebody in a zone where there's never been, significant conflict, or somebody in an urban area where things are fine and, one's life is, a job and family or, hobbies, and we feel safe as it is. I mean, or relatively safer than conflict zones. And that entire world just seems so far removed from us. Yet, I actually think more and more, because of internet and connectivity and employment, the time has actually come now when you can't, even if it's not something you can fully comprehend, it's not something you can turn a blind eye to any longer, right?
I think, especially when you're talking in the context of growing intolerance, we are going to have more and more instances of violence erupt in regions where they probably never did before. So if people living in urban cities that seem to be, it may seem like you're so far away from these conflict affected regions, are at least able to look at understanding conflict or the experiences of children in this region as an investment, right? You need much more people researching these concerns. You need public advocating for changes at an institutional level, for changes at policy level. And this cannot all be done only by people in these small regions. Right? You need more discourses happening on it, exchange of ideas happening on how can we better the system, how can we accommodate different types of children with different backgrounds, different issues. So it is something that is eventually going to benefit everybody, if not today, then tomorrow. So I definitely think at least I consider it to be an investment, that if we are able to reach a stage, I mean, I'm talking, when I'm talking of India as a whole, if we're able to reach a stage where we understand mental health from a very cultural lens, we are able to see how conflict intersects with mental health and gender and disability, right? It is something that is going to benefit everybody involved to a smaller or a larger extent.
Yeah, and I definitely feel one of the ways to achieving that is also talking about it and spreading awareness on it. So in that sense, I think this conversation has been extremely helpful, and thank you so much for sharing all that you have. Thank you.
Thank you, Sonali.
And, if I may say, for me, one of the most revealing things that happened when I felt that I am more connected to every region in this country than I ever thought before was just last year around the time of Diwali. I use an app to book ladies from the salon to come home. I had booked one, and she was brilliant. She was such a good worker, so happy, so smiling. And she used to always come in the daytime, but around the Diwali season, it was extremely busy. So I booked her in the night. She came at 7 o'clock, and that girl was on the verge of a breakdown. And she said, "I'm so sorry. I need this money. I need to send it home." She's from an area in Kashmir, and she's come here to earn for her family back there. But she said, "I'm just so stressed at night. I am so scared. I can't help it. The minute the darkness falls, it it just, I'm so sorry." And she kept crying and crying, and it made me feel that, look, I read about it in the news all the time, but it's always, and I feel, that this is not right. And I feel that connection and that emotional resonance, but it's never come to my house. And now it's here and it's with me. And that's what trauma is. It never really goes away. It will remain. I remember this, it's such a powerful Instagram reel that somebody put up. It said that trauma remains in the air and it will circulate. If you don't do something about it, it will continue to circulate. It will affect generations, and it will start to affect your life, your country, your economic, productivity, and society ultimately. It's like a very delicate food chain, like the balance of nature. It upsets things. So that was a very, very important moment for me. And the next moment was, of course, the first time I ever spoke to Parvathy, which really highlighted so many issues for me with child protection services and what's needed to be done in the future. If you gained a fresh perspective from this episode, please do rate us. We are available on Apple, Google, and Spotify. And if there's any issue or health condition that you'd like to know more about, we'd be happy to hear your thoughts and perhaps plan an episode around it. You can write to us at pods@indiatoday.com, or you can message us on 8588 966 996.